So this is a kind of the latest edition of the Crime Time debate. Now, we've had these before, and they've generally been polite. Have
really?
Well, occasionally, haven't they? I mean, you know, we're all very well-mannered people, everybody on this screen, I can see that. So the idea was to discuss what we thought amongst us were the best 10 books of the last decade. Now, before you say anything, we know that's a totally meaningless and totally arbitrary decision, but it's just ones that impressed us. So we've come up with I think, an impressive list. Maxim Jakubowski, who I'll be introducing shortly, correctly says we will not get through everything. But what we're going to do is we're going to publish on the Crime Time website tomorrow all of our choices. So you will see our 10 books for the decade, and then you'll see our second 10 books, because it's very hard to choose. And interspersed with this discussion will be the odd discussion of topics. So let's see how many people we've got now. We've now got 55 people. So I think it's time to start introducing this very, very impressive panel that we have. I hope anybody watching this realizes just how impressive this panel is. You may never get these 6 people in one room together again, so to speak, of virtual.
Oh, please, don't say that, Barry.
I was enjoying him saying it, actually, Ayo.
I would like us all to be in a room together at some stage.
Well, you and I were in a room together. We had our first meeting with an author last night, did we not?
Yes, we did.
Our first post-lockdown lobster and champagne with an author.
Yeah, preamble, yes.
In fact, before we actually start, I would say that of the authors that we can see on the screen, because at least 3 of the people have books coming out, I think we expect a champagne and lobster supper from them. Ayo, do you think?
Yes, that goes without saying.
You know, Laura is, and
yeah, that'll be good.
Because Maxim can afford it, so you know. Okay, let's start introducing the panel. So, for our Crime Time summer debate, which is the 10 books of the decade in our individual opinions, I'll start with Laura Wilson. Now, Laura Wilson is the author of 13 acclaimed psychological crime novels. Stratton's War won the CWA Ellis Peters Award for Best Historical Mystery. The Lover won the Prix du Poulard Européen, and 2 of her books have been shortlisted for the CWA Gold Dagger, as well as writing crime fiction, lecturing in it at City University, and co-organizing the Killer Women Festival. She has, for the last 14 years and counting, also been the Guardian's crime fiction reviewer. So do you find, Laura, that lots of authors are very nice to you?
Yeah, I know it's not for my bonny blue eyes, mate. But they are. Yeah, they offer sweets saying, go on, take the whole bag and stuff like that.
Yes, it'd be nice to think that people liked us for who we were, but I think those days are probably gone, aren't they?
Yeah. You know what, Barry? I had to have dealings with my solicitor recently, not for a bad thing, just something. And she said, do you know you're a politically exposed person? And I said, beg your pardon. And she said, well, basically it means you're bribable. And the only thing anyone's ever, as far as I know, tried to bribe any of us with is posh lunch, which I just thought was really funny. Politically exposed, you probably are too.
Yeah, I have to tell you this, Laura, that about 10 years ago, I did receive a crate of wine, 10 bottles of wine, and it didn't affect my opinion because I'm totally unbribable.
Because you were so pissed, you couldn't remember, but yeah.
No point. So our second panelist tonight is a man who never sleeps. This is Paul Burke. Paul Burke, who has energy levels. I used to think I had good energy levels, but Paul's make me look like Rip Van Winkle. He writes about crime for Crime Time, NB New Books Magazine, Crime Fiction Lover, and the European Literature Network, and is the editor and co-host of Crime Time FM. So the people who really run Crime Time FM, for anybody who's interested in that, are Victoria Selman and Paul Burke. They are the real movers and shakers who keep that turning over, and they're doing fantastic work with it. So I think Paul is a terrific interviewer. He's very different from me because he's subtle, he's nuanced, he's understated, but he brings people out. And then we have Ayo Onatade. Now, what do I say about Ayo Onatade?
Please, don't know.
Well, she's my unofficial researcher. When I've written a book on crime fiction, I tend to run it past her, and she will say, well, hang on, where is X? and Y died in 1924, not 1933. So that's her greatest use in life. But let's read out about her other uses. She's a CWA Red Herring Award winner. She's a freelance crime fiction blogger, reviewer, critic. She has an eclectic taste in crime fiction, and her research interests include historical fiction, especially crime, of course, and literary criticism. She's a former chair of the CWA Short Story Dagger and judge of the Nio Marsh Awards. She's currently chair of this HWA, Historical Writers Association, Debut Crown, and a judge for the Strand Magazine Critics Award. She also looks after the Supreme Court judges. I got that right, didn't I?
I was hoping you were going to forget that.
I always used to say the High Court judges, but it's the Supreme Court judges.
Well, at least you got it right this time.
Indeed. So unlike the rest of us, she has a real job. And then we have Victoria Selman. Now, Victoria Selman is going places. So take a look at Victoria now, if you've got her on your screen, whether you've got the gallery view or whether it's just my mug you've got on the screen, because she's going to change when success really kicks in. It's starting, but it's still bubbling under at the moment. So Victoria is the author of the critically acclaimed Zeba Mackenzie series. Her debut novel, Blood for Blood, was shortlisted for the prestigious CWA Debut Dagger Award and an Amazon charts #1 bestseller for 5 weeks. She sold over 500,000 copies. She writes for The Independent and co-hosts Crime Time FM with me and Paul Burke. And her first standalone thriller, Truly Darkly Deeply, will be published by no less than Quercus next summer. Now, before I ask you a question, I'm going to ask a question. I've just got Ayo's face on the screen. What about the rest of you?
We've got yours, Barry.
But you?
Yes. I can see everybody.
Not that there's anything wrong with seeing your face on the screen, Ayo.
I'm not going to take that in any bad way.
Of course you are. So, Victoria, when's the publication book of your novel?
It's coming out in July next year.
Okay, well, we're looking forward to that, and we expect early proofs, as well as the crate of wine, which should arrive with it.
The lobster and champagne.
Yes. So, in fact, I'm going to read out about Maxim Jakubowski from what I wrote about him in Crime Fiction, The Reader's Guide. I've written about Maxim a lot over the years. We've known each other decades. So Maxim is an ex-bookstore owner. He's an editor. He's a writer, currently chair of the Crime Writers Association, which is something I think one might mention in the present context. I wrote, as well as being one of the most respected editors in the crime genre, bringing back into print many neglected names, and proprietor of the much-missed London mecca of crime enthusiasts, Murder One on Charing Cross Road. I'm sure you all remember that.
Oh, definitely.
Those of you who are old enough to remember it. And he's an idiosyncratic writer of fiction. His phantasmagorical novels synthesize a variety of elements into a heady brew. Is that good enough, Maxim? Do you think that's a... Do I do you justice with that introduction?
Absolutely.
So let's get down to business. We are now going to discuss the crime books of the decade. Now, I've asked everybody to be pithy and brief, because we have got a lot to get through in an hour and, well, less than an hour and a half now. So I'm going to kick the ball off, and we hopefully aren't just going to all be agreeing on this, because some of us may think that these books are overrated. So working backwards in my case, 2020, I've chosen The Devil in the Deep Blue Water, The Deep Water by Stuart Turton. And there were 2 writers who had to prove something that month. One was Stuart Turton, and The Devil and the Dark Water got the same kind of reviews that the very audacious 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle won. Now, a lot of people, I'm not going to ask about that book, I'm going to ask the panel, who got through the first book, because it was very long.
I did. I loved it. I loved the first book. I just thought it was just so ingenious in the way in which it was written. And, you know, you had to concentrate. Admittedly, I really had to concentrate on it. But I loved it to bits. I thought it was a really unique way of writing.
Right. Laura, did you get all the way through it?
I did, but I felt I had to have a lie down afterwards. I mean, it was ludic and clever, and I enjoyed it, but it was a difficult read.
Right.
But I thought it was very, very good.
Yes. Do you think, Maxim, that authors these days should be writing slightly shorter books, or books the length of War and Peace and Proust?
I'd like them to write books of all lengths. I mean, The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle didn't really bother me in terms of the length. It's just the book that bothered me. And in fact, I didn't actually finish it. I gave up about 2/3 of the way in. I thought it was overly clever, and basically it became a game, and the characters had no psychological density, and that detracted from some brilliant writing, some absolutely brilliant plotting, but it just got a bit too much.
Fair enough. So I was worried this would all be us all patting each other on the back and agreeing, and that's clearly not going to be the case. Did you read it, Victoria?
I did, and I don't agree with Maxim. I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was very, very clever. And actually, I recently interviewed Stu for my On the Sofa with Victoria show that I have on the Crime Time podcast. And what really struck me was how long it took him to, I mean, he came up with a concept, but of course the concept is one thing, but how do you tell the concept into a story, and how do you craft it together? And actually the story of how he did that was as intriguing in many ways as what he actually produced. So do have a listen to that when it comes out. It's a really, really great episode, and really great to talk to him.
Okay.
Not plugging my show, of course. There.
You're all permitted at least one plug. So I'm not going to ask everyone to comment on everyone's choice, or we will not get through the entire list. But I will finish by asking Paul what you thought of Stuart's new book, the latest one, the one I chose, and his first book.
Well, the first book, I agree with everybody. Oh, you disagree? Sorry. No, I honestly, I tend to more towards Maxim with that one, but I did really enjoy The Devil in Deep Water. It was obviously very, very different. But I have to admit, fantasy's not my favorite sort of crossover genre, let's say. So, right. But I did enjoy it. I thought it was a great adventure, and I thought it was a lot of fun.
Okay, well, Paul, while you're on the screen, your list that I'm reading from is not in numerical order. So
no, I'm a bad boy.
Okay, what would you like to choose for 2020 as your choice of the book of 2020?
Right, I didn't actually do it quite like that, I'm afraid. Well, no, I didn't. Honestly, I didn't. So I can't really start with that. I'll start with The Heretics by Leonardo Padura, as translated by Anna Kushner. It's an historical noir that flips between the 17th century and today. It's a Mario Conde book. I don't know if people are familiar with the policeman stroke.
Yes.
Private detective. Anyway, it's set around the arrival of a boat in Havana in 1939 with Jewish passengers, which is sent back, and a family who have a Rembrandt. But you've got a really strange mix here of this historical adventure, which is brilliant, but also very heavy noir. And it really does sum up the character of Cuba if you follow the series through.
Yes. Well, Padura is a very interesting writer, and it's nice that we are already moving around, and we're not going to be Anglo-centric, clearly. So, Ayo, you picked for 2020 a favorite book of mine, and I think this took a lot of people by storm, Blacktop Wasteland by S.A. Cosby.
Yes, I mean, I actually have got to say that I actually met Sean when I was in Florida in 2018, and the book hadn't been published yet, and he was talking about it, and it kind of immediately piqued my interest. And when it came out, I just thought, wow, it's even better than what he was telling all of us about. I mean, it's set down in the South. It's all those nuances about the way people are treated down in the South. It's a fast read. It's very, very noir. And also it is very, very intense about relationships and what's going on. And I defy anybody to say, actually, this is not a book that just literally changed the way in which Black people are writing crime fiction nowadays.
Yes. Well, it's interesting you say that, because I thought that at the Daggers, both Abir Mukherjee and Vas Khan talked about diversity in fiction.
Yes.
And they were talking about having more Black women crime writers. And now, apart from Attica Locke, it seems to be a male preserve at the moment. There are some very good Black male writers coming out.
Gina Mitchell, excuse me.
Yeah, good.
And also the wonderful author of My Sister, the Serial Killer.
Yes.
Yes.
So I mean, brilliant.
I think there are more American Black crime writers, female Black crime writers, than there are British ones, which is rather sad. But I mean, there's Rosa Howell Hall. There's, oh gosh, I can see the names in front of me and I just can't. No. But the Blacktop Wasteland, I think if anybody's looking to find out and read about what goes on in the South and how Black people are treated down in the South, read this book.
Yes, I agree with that. So Maxim, your 2020 choice was one when I had to pick just one book for the eye. They asked me to pick just one book of the year. I picked, as you did, We Begin at the End by Chris Whittaker.
Ah, sorry.
That's all right.
And basically, I mean, I was delighted when I did actually win the Dagger. And even though I'm chair of CWI, it had nothing to do with me, as the judges are quite independent. So I was delighted. I was actually chair of the judges 4 years ago when Chris Whittaker's first novel, Tall Oaks, won the Creasy. So this was a confirmation that we got our choice right. I think it's a wonderful book.
Yeah.
I think it's basically, and the fact that Chris is so damn young.
I know.
And looks even younger and writes as if he's 100 in his wisdom and the empathy for his characters. I mean, for me, it was a revelation.
Yes.
It really took me by storm. And talking obviously Hollywood high concept, and of course it's sold to Disney. For me, it was like a modern To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, moving on to Victoria, her choice for 2020 was We Begin at the End by Chris Whittaker.
Yes, I've been nodding away and agreeing with everything. Sorry, I know we're not supposed to agree with each other, Maxim, but absolutely. And
Well,
actually,
you can, Victoria. You can.
this one I'm going to agree. And in fact, what's so brilliant about this book is everyone in the crime community loves this book. I mean, I think there would have been a riot if he hadn't have won. I really do. And it's just utterly brilliant. And I agree. I think Duchess is very reminiscent of Scout. It's something that really struck me as well. But also that sense of place made, again, even more extraordinary by the fact he's never been to, and my geography is rubbish, so I'm going to name the wrong places in the book, but it's Montana, isn't it, is one of the places. And then, but he's never been to either. And yet you would think he lived and breathed it. It's just extraordinary.
Do you think it was necessary to be familiar with Harper Lee to fully enjoy the book?
No, I don't. I don't, because I think it's enjoyable in its own way. But I just think I loved Harper. I mean, who doesn't love To Kill a Mockingbird? So that just adds a different nuance to it. But no, it's an extraordinary book and a wonderful achievement, and he deserves every accolade he's hopefully going to still be getting. I hope there are many more to come.
We're trying to, before I get to Laura's choice, we're trying to interject the bits of discussion. What do you all think about the fact that when Harper Lee's original draft of To Kill a Mockingbird was issued, and we learned that the man we thought was impossibly noble was actually a bit of a racist? Was it good that was? Did we have to change our mind about Atticus Finch when we learnt the way Harper Lee first thought of him?
Do you not think it's actually quite honest of her to have thought of him in that way? I mean, it was a terrible time down there, and that racism was it wasn't just life; it was a way of life.
Yeah.
And I think to just brush over that, is that right? And I think now it's certainly I prefer the way he's portrayed. But there's an argument. Yes. My mother was telling me this today. Actually, I don't know what you guys all think of it, but apparently To Kill a Mockingbird's coming off the school curriculum.
Yeah, it was in the paper. Yeah.
Really? Why?
What do you think? Because there were, and it'd be really genuinely very interested to hear what you think of it. But the idea is, because there is obviously such inherent racism in the book because of the time it's portraying, that the worry is that people will see that as, well, that's an okay way to be.
Now, hold on a second. But this is where I have a problem, because I appreciate when books were written at a certain time, they portrayed what was going on during that period. I'm not saying I agree with them. It is just the way the books were written at the period. And if you start taking all these books off the curriculum, people are never going to learn.
Exactly.
Yeah, I completely agree with Ayo. You shouldn't sanitize history at all.
Exactly.
Exactly. It's not saying we agree with what happened, and in some ways, it shows you more what was terrible about what happened, rather than
and you can see the changes.
Yes. And why it was wrong and how
view of history. If everything is well, Laura, your choice for 2020 was Blacktop Wasteland by S.A. Cosby.
Yeah, which I thought was a fabulous book, but for the reasons I just talked about, but because it was about this chap he's trying to be a good man, he's trying to be a good father, and he's trying to leave a criminal milieu. And I think those narratives are fascinating. You get something slightly similar in Dodgers by Bill Beverly, which we're going to talk about later. Also, as the person I just mentioned, Dreda Say Mitchell, her first book, Running Hot.
Yes, I remember that.
How difficult it is to leave and live a, what would you call, a straight life, whatever you call. And Beauregard, he's trying his damnedest, but he's got debts mounting up, all sorts. His mother's about to be thrown out of the retirement home. He's actually got very good reasons for doing what he does. And also this complicated relationship with his own father, who has been himself a criminal. And I just thought it was so well done.
Yes.
It knocked my socks off. And also, for anyone who wants summer reading recommendation, his second book, Razorblade Tears, also is wonderful.
Yes,
exactly. I think Razorblade Tears may in some ways be even better.
Okay, I'm going to move everyone.
I think it might be our book of 2021.
We're still on the first book, so let's move swiftly along, people. My second choice, and I'll only say one sentence about it, and taking what Maxim said about books should be as long as they should be. The Border by Don Winslow, which for me was a kind of Zola-esque, sprawling, rather like James Ellroy at his best before he lost his mojo. James Lee Burke, this epic. I don't know, anybody else managed to get through The Border?
Yeah, I absolutely love the trilogy.
Yeah, definitely.
He gets the personal and he gets the big issues as well. And these books are so much about character. You know, it's a fantastic read. Okay. I think also, I mean, we're talking Borderlands, and I love Borderlands in crime fiction anyway. They're so, interesting and sexy.
So, Laura, your second book was Kill, Redact. This for 2019.
Yeah, I think I was the only person who reviewed this.
The only person who chose that.
I absolutely, but who reviewed it at all? I had a look round. I loved this book, and I loved it partly because I'm very keen on one of my favourite books ever is Christy Mallory's own Double Entry by B.S. Johnson, who was, as you may or may not know, was sort of Britain's one-man literary avant-garde in the 60s and early 70s. But don't let it put you off. It's a great book. This was sort of similar, and it's a wonderful, I won't go into details, but it's a wonderful portrait of a man really in the grip of a mental breakdown. It's all of sort of about white male privilege. This guy thinks he's in control. His wife has been killed in a terrorist attack, and kill redacted is that he is planning to murder the person he considers responsible, whose name is redacted. But we can see, if you like, the shadowy outlines of 7/7 and maybe Tony Blair really behind that.
Laura,
and it's about what happens. And I don't want to do a spoiler because I want you to read it, but it's wonderful.
Now, Laura rushed in to praise that book before I'd even finished saying the author's name. So Annie, the author, was Anthony Good.
Yeah, it's a debut.
Yeah, open brackets, redacted, close brackets by Anthony Good. So Victoria's second choice is a writer. I was told off by this writer and his editor because I outed him, not for being gay.
Oh, gosh, yes, delight.
And it's an open secret now that Steve Mosby writes as Alex North, which in fact is the same name as the composer of Spartacus, but we won't go into that. So Victoria, you picked The Whisper Man for 2019 by Alex North.
By Alex North, not Steve Mosby. Yes, brilliant book. I think what was so wonderful about it for me was, I mean, obviously it's a great mystery, and the creepy supernatural elements were also brilliantly done. I loved how they were sort of rationalized towards the end as well. That was very clever. But for me, what made it a really standout read was, we've talked a bit about relationships before, haven't we? But it was the relationship between the father and son. And I just found it so terribly moving. And so tenderly done. It just elevated the book so much for me. So really enjoyed that.
Fair enough. So Maxim, you seem to have skipped a couple of years, but you've got various series. Would you rather talk about your 2017 choice, Gravesend by William Boyle, or would you rather talk about the Slough House series by Mick Herron? I give you a choice.
Well, I think I'd rather go for William Boyle's book because as much as I like Mick Herron's series, it has drawn so much praise already. So there's very little I can say that is new. I think what I like about William Boyle is that he's very much in the American hardball tradition, and but basically he writes about people you can really feel. They are flesh and blood. You can feel them through the page. They're mostly based in Brooklyn, and basically it's all about lives going wrong and about life itself, and that's what I liked about it so much. I think it's a very underrated book.
Okay, well, the second choice for Ayo for 2019, you actually picked Ayo the wrong book because I am in Laura Littman's last book as a sleazy lawyer, but I'm not in Lady in the Lake. So why was it that appealed to you?
Well, first of all, I've got to say I'm a big Raymond Chandler fan. So The Lady in the Lake, the title alone, it just kind of like just did something for me. And I've also been a very big Laura Lippman fan, because she has this unique way of writing where she just literally always draws you in. And with Lady in the Lake, it was set in Baltimore's 1960s. It's about a woman trying to assert her independence. And the way in which it is written just makes you feel so sympathetic towards the woman and what she has to go through, but also quite anxious to see where does she go from here and what the ending is. And Laura has this way of writing that you continuously just want to keep on turning the pages.
Yes. She's also the heir apparent, although she's an unlikely one physically, to Edgar Allan Poe. She's a great Edgar Allan Poe fan, and I believe she leaves a rose on Edgar Allan Poe's grave in her native Baltimore, which is a nice...
Baltimore, her hometown, yes.
So, okay, on to Paul now. So, Paul, you're leaping around again. So, I'm going to give you a choice, Paul. You can either talk about the Maids version by Daniel Woodrell, or you can talk about the Cartel series by Don Winslow. Which would you like to talk about?
Okay, well, we've done a little bit on Don Winslow, so I'll do the Maids version. It's set in the aftermath of an explosion at a dance hall. There are lots of versions about what happened, but one of them's the Maids and nobody listens. So she's telling her grandson this story decades later. It's the language is brilliant in this novel. It's getting into the location and the characters, and it's just elegant prose. And I love these kind of American novels. It's brief, it's sharp, and the language is just beautiful. And for that reason, I love it.
Okay. Maxim,
can I just quickly
go ahead, yes.
About Daniel Woodrell? I think it's such a shame that he's not as well known as he should be.
Yes, he's very, very neglected.
Yes,
people will know Winter's Bone, perhaps.
Yeah, he's an amazing writer, and he has got this a great sense of place. And I just wish he had got more well known.
Okay, well, I'll say to all the people watching and listening, this will all be appearing on the Crime Time website tomorrow. So if you don't catch the name of someone like Daniel Woodrell, don't worry, it will be on the website. Maxim, you said Mick Herron's Slough series didn't need any more praise. Well, neither does 2017, your choice, A Legacy of Spies by John le Carré.
Well, I think le Carré can never go wrong, and I'm already looking forward to this autumn and for his one and only posthumous book. I think basically this particular book is almost a summation of all these books. Obviously, I love the Smiley books, and of course, Smiley appears as a minor character. I think it's basically a melancholy Twilight book, which, in fact, I mean, let's see the new book this autumn, but which should have been the final book in his writing career, because it draws it to a wonderfully quiet close where the world of spying a la le Carré comes to an end, not with a bang, but with a whimper.
Yes, I agree. That had a valedictory quality, which made you think that might have been the best final book. There's a head peering to your left there, Maxim. I can see a human eye. Listen, I'm going to pass my next choice on because we've got a lot of books to get through. I'll just mention that for 2018, I chose Resurrection Bay by Emma Viszczyk. But I'm going to go to 2017's choice for my choice. And I think everyone's going to agree on this one. I'd be very surprised if everyone's going to argue with me. The Dry by Jane Harper.
And I'm going to disagree.
Yeah. Oh, are you? So
yes.
You're going to be the dissenting voice on this one.
I'm going to be the dissenting voice. I do appreciate it. I understand the writing. I appreciate the sense of place, which was very, very good. But I actually didn't enjoy it all that much.
Okay. Oh, well, I'm glad some of you are disagreeing. What about the rest of you? Did you all agree with me about The Dry?
Yeah, loved it.
Okay.
It was wonderful.
Victoria?
I'm thinking there were bits I loved, but I wonder if it was worth all the hype it had. I thought the writing was beautiful, obviously.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it was the beauty of the writing, which is what really propelled it. But actually, at its heart, the mystery wasn't as engaging as others I've read, or more engaging.
Yes.
And I don't know. Remember at the time it came out, Australian crime fiction wasn't big, was it? She almost set that scene. Yeah. And I wonder if that was part of its appeal. It was something new and different. And if it were to be brought, would it have the same take up, I wonder?
When I did the column about that, we had to find a word for it. And I said, okay, what about bush noir? And then the editor and I both realized that actually bush noir was just not going to fly. So we called it outback noir instead.
Laura said to me, I'm going to interrupt our run through of books now, because Laura said that a good topic for us to discuss, so we're briefly going to interject topics, was changes we've noticed in the crime genre over the last decade. And I would say to you, Laura, that one of them is the growth of hype. There are a lot of overhyped books. Would you agree?
Yeah, I'm always a bit sort of wary of discussing this, because very often somebody's paid telephone numbers for something and you read it and you just think, what? You know, and very often the publishing feeding frenzy that let's pay lots and lots and lots of money, the public are just sort of baffled by it.
Yeah.
And there's a disconnect there. And I am at a loss to understand why sometimes a book is, the hype is justified, but from the publisher, I mean, but very often one is just left completely baffled. It's weird.
Do you think it's almost the hype itself that becomes the problem?
Yeah.
So if you hype something so much, it's always going to fall short of expectation.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, sometimes when a book is hyped too much, I really get very reluctant to read it.
Do you all think hype, when The Woman in the Window appeared, which is a very controversial book with a controversial author, the controversy about the author was happening at about the same time, but was that a good example of a book that was probably overhyped?
Yes.
I really enjoyed it, I have to say, and I was unaware enough of the author at the time when I picked it up. I thought it was a really good read, and you know, obviously there's all the Hitchcockian elements, but I love Hitchcock, and for me, pop Hitchcock that's only a good thing. I really enjoyed it. It was very page turny. It was, to me, it was very original, and in some ways, the author's story only heightens the appeal. That's controversial, isn't it?
We mentioned two books here. One is called The Woman in the Window, and another one, The Lady in the Lake. Do you think authors should start thinking of new titles?
Certainly, there are fewer girls, I think, in them.
Possibly.
Yes.
Titles are hard, I have to tell you, as an author. Laura, you
that's why the Bible comes in.
Yeah, well, I was quite pissed off because I wrote a book called The Wrong Girl, which involved a girl. She was 10.
Right.
She was not 32. And everyone said, oh, but you've used the word, what was I supposed to call it? The wrong female child. I mean, you know. But I think that publishing, like anything else, goes in fashions. You know, like that we've had a lot of domestic noir.
Yes.
Okay. You know, there are fashions, and I think you get an awful lot of brouhaha and excitement and stupidly exaggerated claims about certain kinds of books. It happened with the Nordic noir, you know, which is great, but doesn't do anything that any other person's kind of noir, you know, you please. Laura, and then you go on to a different thing, and it's like clothes, it's like everything, it's just fashions.
Laura, there are some very good books written on Nordic noir, you know, I have to tell you.
Oh, well, yes, of course.
Yes. Well, let's quickly, before we get off hype, Paul, do you agree that there are books which are overhyped in the current climate? Is that something you
do, and I dislike it very much when it's a celebrity involved. To be honest, sometimes when you read it, the book might be very good. But, I mean, there's a lot of fuss about this one, The Falling, at the moment, T.J. Newman. And I think it's partly connected to a film rights that are already sorted and that, you know, and a seven-figure, $1 million figure sort of thing going with it. And it's a good read. But it's a good beach read.
Well, would you say
it doesn't do anything clever or special? It's just a good read.
Okay, Maxim, bringing you into this, the Richard Osman book, which is a phenomenal, stonking success. I know at least 3 people who didn't read who bought that book. Is the success of that book to do with hype, or is it to do with the public face and the celebrity of its author?
I think it's a combination of both. Obviously, having worked in publishing for many years, obviously, I'm aware of what the publishing machine can do. When it came to Richard Osman's book, I must say that I was basically wary of it, but once I read it, I really enjoyed it. I think basically he came up with the right book at the right time. I mean, it's a lovely romp.
Yes, I agree.
And I think
it's good fun.
And of course, it was easy to promote because, of course, he's on TV every single day.
But I also agree with what Maxim says about the right book at the right time. It was a cozy, it was nice. And God knows, last year we needed a bit of comfort reading. And I don't know about anybody else, but certainly during that first lockdown, my concentration was so poor that I was listening to things on audio, but apart from what you might call duty reads, which is what I reviewed, and very good books, don't get me wrong, it wasn't a chore to read it, I didn't manage to read anything at all for recreation for 3 months. And I think something more gentle was very appropriate just to that time, which was so tough for everybody.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree.
Well,
it's hard to write as well. I don't know if you found that, Laura, but I found it reading.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, let's get back to our lists. And the next book I'm going to pick is an interesting one because it ties in something we already discussed. Now, the publisher of this book is hopefully still listening. I guess he is, Ian Mills, who published a book that won multiple awards, and it was my 2016 choice, Dodgers by Bill Beverly.
Excellent.
Now, Ayo agrees with me here. Now, this is an interesting one. Ian Mills has admitted to me, and if you hear it here first, he'd have more difficulty publishing this book about a black protagonist by a white, middle-aged male writer today than he did back in 2016. Does that tie into what we were saying earlier, Ayo?
I think, I think I've got to agree. I'm not. I've got to agree with Ian's comment. Not that I personally agree, per se. I actually think that if you've done your homework, spoken to various people who within the community about black people and what they do, and you actually have somebody read it properly and say, look, actually this wouldn't happen. It's a bit like me and work. I can't read crime books that I've got caught serially sitting in them. I start picking holes in them because of the day job.
Yeah.
And I don't see why. I think a good writer is a good writer, and as long as he gets his facts right, does his research, then fine.
Okay, well, in fact, Maxim, you also picked Dodgers for 2016. As a writer, do you now feel you're more constrained about the subjects you can write about as we're all being pushed into the area of only writing about our own immediate ethnic or experience?
Well, it's a difficult question for me because, in fact, I have a new novel coming out next week, and it's not even a crime book, it's a fantasy book. I mean, Laura was talking about how she felt during the early days of the pandemic and being locked up, so to speak. I ended up by writing a fantasy book during that period. And it's a book about mermaids. And maybe because in parallel with Monique Roffey, who's a good friend, who wrote her Mermaid of the Black Conch. So maybe the next trend, I hope, will be mermaids. But basically, it's difficult to say. I mean, I try to write about what I know. And I know nothing about mermaids. So who knows?
But that's a funny thing, isn't it? The whole write what you know, because I battle that. They always say that's in creative writing classes. But if I were writing what I would know, it'd be I'd write about being a soccer mum or getting my children to tidy their rooms and failing. And
it's not good advice for crime writers, though, is it, Victoria?
But I don't think that's what it means. I think it's oversimplified. I think write what you know is really write what you're really fascinated by. So, I mean, I'm fascinated by criminal psychology and that kind of true crime. And I'm not a criminal. I'm not a forensic psychologist, but I'm fascinated, and that maybe becomes what I know.
Well, Aidan has just said that the cultural politics should not stifle creativity. I think we'd all agree with that. So let's move on to Paul's next choice, 2013, a writer who we've already been praising here. The Cutting Season by Attica Locke.
Right. Well, an absolutely stunning book. And actually it followed a rather stunning debut as well. It's just that it's so beautifully written. It's so empathetic and so thought-provoking that it's just a fantastic read. I mean, You've got history, you've got family, it's got poverty and inequality. There are so many issues in there, but the characters at the heart of it are absolutely fascinating.
Yes. Well, I'm going to pass
I'm trying to be brief.
Okay, you were brief there, yes. I'm going to pass on your 2018 choice, Aya, because we already talked about Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. And for 2017, you chose the award-winning The Long Drop by Denise Miner.
Yes. I just think that she has this way of writing that draws you in so much. And she has this way of a great sense of place. And even sometimes when you're talking to her about her books and her writing, aside from the animation, which is brilliant, she's incredibly thoughtful. And all of this just comes across in the way in which she writes things. And for me, The Long Drop, if I'm not mistaken, was that the first one where she started doing a bit of true crime into her books?
Correct.
I think so. Yeah.
Yes. that, you know, I thought the way in which she did that was brilliant, because merging the two things together, because I'm not generally a true crime person, but this completely fascinated me.
Yes, I think she is the real deal. And maybe she's doing something that British authors aren't doing. I've got to be careful here because there's several of them in the room. American novels are often more ambitious in their reach and their canvas. And I think she's doing that. For instance, that's not a book just about the Black experience, is it?
No.
It's a book about the human experience. Yeah. So, Laura, you picked for 2017 The Dry by Jane Harper.
Yeah, actually, just coming back to what you were saying about the long drop there, it's interesting because something that has happened in the last 10 years is a massive increase of interest in true crime, all the podcasts and everything. If you remember how true crime books used to be very schlocky, cut and paste, sensationalistic, with titles that dripped blood, do you remember? And then it suddenly got respectable. You know, podcasts and like that. And it's become a big thing. And I've noticed that there's much more of a trend for fiction authors to use it in riff off true cases. I mean, I've been doing it for quite a lot of years, because quite a lot of my books are that, but it's been much more prevalent now, which I think is very interesting, almost as if there's a merge going on.
Do you think it's to do with our fascination with psychology? Because that's the new trend as well, isn't it? I mean, looking back 10 years ago, there wasn't this sort of psychological insight. And I think a lot of certainly why I'm fascinated by true crime stories is what drives people, which of course is at the heart of so much crime fiction anyway. And do you think that's where the merge is
I suspect that's got a bearing on it, because it's like Ruth Rendell said, murder itself is not very interesting, but why people murder, that is what is fascinating.
That's
and I think that's what we're going to get to.
The difference between the literary true crime, In Cold Blood, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, Somebody's Husband, Somebody's Son. Yeah. It's a really well-written true crime. And then there are the schlocky ones about the crossbow cannibal killer.
Yeah, right. But most of them were that. They were very free of Ken Rillington Place or In Cold Blood or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me get you back to so we talked about Dodgers. So for your 2015 choice, Laura, was Jax Miller, Freedom's Child.
Oh, yeah, this was a debut novel. In fact, 7 out of my 10 were debut novels. There's something about a debut, the energy, the chuck everything at it but the kitchen sink, that I particularly appreciate. And this was a wonderful novel. I loved this character. We meet her in a bar. She drinks too much. She's, has this very haphazard life. She's in a witness protection program. And it's all about what she will do to get to her children.
Yes.
She's somebody who's had a very rough time, but actually she's a very good mother. And just how brave and how determined. I think actually Jax Miller now does true crime.
Yes.
In fact, I think she crossed over to do true crime. But I thought she's very young when she wrote it. I thought it was a smashing book, and that character just jumped off the page.
In fact, it was the runner-up to Bill Beverly's Dodgers when I was a judge.
Okay.
Dagger.
Right.
And I've been in touch, in fact, with Anne, obviously, who writes as Jax. And she's written 2 novels since, which have been turned down by every UK and US publisher.
Yeah, really?
Which is why she's now doing true crime.
Gosh, I had no idea about that.
They were published in France, and they're actually quite good. But now she's mostly doing true crime and producing a TV true crime series.
Oh, I said, well, that all makes sense, because I was sort of all, puckered up for the next one, and I did wonder what had happened.
Okay, well, let's go to Paul's next choice. So, Paul, nobody could accuse you of not being a European, because you picked The Crossroads by Niccolo Amaniti, translated by Jonathan Hunt. So what was it about that appealed to you?
Well, I'll tell you what it was. It's the fact that this is the kind of book that makes you're on the side of the misfits and the downtrodden. And it makes you angry about society. And I like that, a book that gets me stirred up by the issues. This is a young boy. His father's a waster. He robs a bank with his friends and tries to drag his son, who's a 13-year-old boy, into the life with him. And it's just that the empathy in the book for the young boy, who could be a hero in some other environment. And it's just such a beautiful book and evoking that.
Okay. Victoria, I'm going to give you a little challenge now. In 1 minute, I want you to tell us the 2 choices of yours. I want your lowdown on 2018 Vox by Christina Dalcher,
Yeah.
And 2018, The Killer You Know by S.R. Masters. What was it about those two books?
About those two books. Okay, you're timing me.
It starts now.
Okay, go. So Vox, what I loved about it, I guess, as a writer, was this idea of only having 100 words you could actually speak a day, and what words would you use? And of course, not being able to read books. So of course, it's a dystopian feminist speculative novel, and there's lots of different elements to it. It's brilliant, it's high speed, it's absolutely excellent in many ways. But for me, it was putting myself in the position, what would I do, how would it impact me? And The Killer You Know is by a lesser-known author, S.R. Masters, who I think what I particularly loved about that book is it's a great mystery. So many of them are, but for me it was the rendition of the 90s, so bringing back my childhood, I guess, and it just really brought it to life. It's told within two different time frames, past and present, and the way that he merges it together. So it was, I guess that was my my treat for myself to pick that book, because it was I just really enjoyed it.
That's pretty good. You did that within a minute. I
talk really fast as well.
Okay, well, my next
you
choice.
don't talk as fast as I do.
My choice in 2014. I've never had to. Victoria and Paul do a lot of author interviews. I bet they've never had to do with this next author. I had to sing to him. I went into the hotel near Victoria, and I was his publicist was looking very frazzled and saying he's in a terrible mood. He's been chewing up young publicists all day, and she said, you might get away with it because I think you're the same age. It was James Ellroy. So I walked into the room and said to him, I think I might be the only person interviewing you who could actually sing Perfidia, and he insisted that I did. So
go on now, Barry, you have to give us.
Nobody used to sing on this show. So Perfidia, I had an ambiguous view of James Ellroy, and I think talking about developments over the last 10 years, which we're doing, I think, although I chose the book, I prefer his earlier work. What do you think, Paul? What's your view?
I definitely prefer his earlier work. He can be very dense and very difficult to read. I mean, I got through the Cold 6000, but it was really hard work. Makes you do a lot of leaping between different things. But yeah, I much prefer. I mean, LA Confidential is one of my favorites for sure. But I would still read anything he writes, though. I have to say that. I mean, have
you read Widespread Panic? Yeah.
No, not yet. No.
Come out. That's actually not bad. Although
it's quite fun, isn't it?
Oh, well, I think that Barry, one of the problems is he's talking about all this old 1950s Hollywood scuttlebutt, and I reckon that anyone who's under about 40 who reads it is going to think that Rock Hudson is just a fictitious character. Yes. I mean, why would they know? You know, because it's so. I did, you know.
Isn't the problem with James Ellroy is unless you get
Ellroy still lives. In his mind, he still lives in the 1950s.
Yeah, that's kind of what I meant.
Actually, didn't he? That history ends for him in the 1950s. Or modern life ends.
Anybody under the age of 30 would not know that Rock Hudson was the emblem of straight masculinity in films, but was actually a gay man masquerading. That's unknown to anyone under the age of 30, surely.
Well, unless you like noir films or really old films.
Yeah.
Okay, now we're going to. Laura has insisted on topics which relate to the last 10 years. So here's a good one. I'm going to give you a plot, and I'm hoping nobody on this panel has written this. Let's call her Belinda, is married to a handsome, successful barrister, lawyer, doctor, you name it. She finds out that he may have been a murderer, that he has a hidden past. We are talking domestic noir. So Laura, why has domestic noir hung around so long when the same plots are appearing again and again?
Well, I think one of the other things you proposed to talk about was the publisher's enduring fascination with the serial killer, which I think we're getting less of now, because actually, if you think about, real life, there are serial killers, but there are far, far more terrible things that happen to women in their homes, because in peacetime, men are more likely to get killed by strangers, whatever. Women are more likely to get killed by the very people who should love and cherish them. Home is a very dangerous place for women, and this reflects that. And I think that's why. But I think for a long time it was thought of to be not a big important subject, but it actually is a very big important subject. And I think that one's going to run and run for that reason.
Okay,
I
Victoria?
think it is, but I agree with you, Barry. Actually, I'm getting really bored of same old, same old. It's a really important subject. It's a really important question that women are not safe, obviously, and that the primary danger comes often from the people who are supposed to cherish them. But in terms of fiction and what we're reading, it just feels like the same. Even the covers seem like rehashes.
Exactly.
You know, that picture of the lit window and the shadowy figure and the.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not saying we haven't had too many of them. I'm saying this is why, you know, they were so popular.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I think to be fair,
but I also think that, remember, when we see things, we're at a different point on the curve, as it were, to the general public. Okay. And also we see everything in aggregate coming through our post box sort of thing. And yes, you're right, there are millions of them and they all look alike.
Well, let me ask a question of the two male panelists, apart from myself. The three males on this panel, we have to read domestic noir because it's kind of our job. Are these books clearly aimed at a female readership and we're interlopers? Paul, what do you think?
No, I mean, first of all, I want to say that I think this is the most important topic when it comes to the number of people killed and that, and most left aside and ignored by crime fiction. My problem with the crime fiction we get is that far too much of it depends on some crazy twist or some wacky plot, and that takes away from the issue. You want to read a book that talks about these issues and really scares the shit out of you. Read Karen Slaughter's new book, which really, really is horrifying. You know, you get nasty shocks in that book because of the reality of the situation, the truth about domestic violence. Yeah. And I'm happy, or not happy, but, you know, I want to read that kind of book. What I don't like is the one where they think fancy twists which detract entirely from the plot.
No.
Isn't the problem with domestic noir that if you've read Jane Eyre and if you've read Rebecca, in which a woman finds that she's married to a man who may be a murderer or certainly has a dark secret, you've read the best domestic noir already.
No, I disagree. And I think that's why it's really good that people like Celia Fremlin, for example, are being reissued. They're wonderful. But I also agree very much with Paul that we have got to peak twist. And can we stop now, please?
Yes,
I mean,
okay.
I freely admit that given a choice, I wouldn't touch it with a barge pole.
Right. Well, while you're on the screen, Ayo, I'm going to move to 2013, in which you and I have the same choice. We have both picked, but I'm going to allow you to talk about it. The Shining by Lauren Bukes.
Wow, what can I say about this? When I first read this, and I'm not really a horror person, and this is a really close genre, and initially I put it down and shoved it to one side, but then I picked it up again and thought, I really have to read this. And it just brought this feeling of being frightened, but also intrigued and trying to work out where this was going to go. It's incredibly well written. And she straddles that cross-genre thing, as in being writing horror and writing crime as well. And sometimes you think you're not sure what you're going to get. But for me, it was one of those books that surprised me immensely. And having read it, I just thought, yep, I'm really pleased that I read it, because otherwise, if I just took one look at it and thought, this has got horror in it, I wouldn't have read it.
Okay, and the answer to Aidan's question is yes, Aidan, at some point, possibly. So the next choice for Victoria, I've got here, as we were talking about this author earlier, when this fuss about Harrogate not having enough women of colour on this year's panel, would you have invited My Sister the Serial Killer by Ian Ken Braithwaite?
I think she's sensational. I think that book was the most brilliant book in its simplicity, in its deadpan humor, and in that sense, you know, that opening scene. Do you remember where she's got the blood and the sort of the calm way? Well, now what's the best way to get the blood out of the carpet? Well, it's going to be this, as if she's got just, you know, a ketchup stain. And I thought it was brilliant. And then the question of, you know, how far would you go for your sister? And I think as well, we were talking about lengths of books earlier, weren't we? And it's a very thin book. I mean, you can read it in about a couple of hours or less. But and I always used to imagine, God, if I handed in a manuscript that was less than X number of thousand words to my agent, who'd just turn around and say, no, go back, pad it out. But that book showed, no, it's nothing to do with length. It's certain books have a certain.
It was tightly written.
Yes.
Perfectly written, just excellent. So
okay.
yes, on a panel.
Laura,
I'm being cut off again, aren't I? Had my 30 seconds.
I'm moving everyone on. Laura, did you read it?
Yes, and I loved it for the same reasons, and especially the practicality of it, and good tips too, I thought. Handy.
Aidan just asked, we're getting on to a choice, Gillian Flynn, Gone Girl, which Maxim. But Maxim, before we get
hang on, Barry, that's 2012. We're going backwards chronologically here, and we're still in 2014.
You think everybody submitted chronological lists? They didn't. They did. Paul is guilty. So I'm going to go to Maxim, who picked another espionage novel here by, in fact, the grandfather of American espionage fiction, 2015, The Mulberry Bush by Charles McCarry.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I mean, I love spy fiction. I love Le Carré, and there was a whole new generation of American espionage writers who worked basically in parallel to him, but who are nowhere as well known as him. You got Robert Littell, you got Olin Steinhauer, you got Dan Fesperman, and Charles McCarry, who was the elder. And I mean, The Tears of Autumn for me is one of the great all-time espionage thrillers. And the wonderful thing about McCarry, who actually worked in the spy establishment in America, so he knows what he was talking about, is that all these books have this connection. It's all about this family, members of the family who are all involved, various generations who appear from book to book, not always in the chronological order. And this particular book was actually his final book, and for me is the epitome of the perfect Cold War espionage thriller.
In fact, we've just seen a question from Louise. Does I Am Pilgrim feature on this list? I don't know if it does. And it might come under the overhyped books, Louise, I have to tell you. But yes. Let's move on to the next choice of Paul. So, Paul, I once sat in a Soho restaurant after the smoking ban had come in, and the author I was sitting with produced a pack of Gauloises. I think you know who I'm going to talk about.
Oh, yeah.
She put her Gauloise into the middle of the table. Her publisher got edgy. The waiters were looking. Then she took a Gauloise out, put it on top. She's a bit of a rebel. And this is Fred Vargas. And you've chosen The Poison Will Remain series by Fred Vargas, translated by Sean Reynolds.
I did indeed. Yes, actually, she'd be one woman I'd be scared to interview. This series is absolutely unique. You've got Adamsberg. He's a bit Sherlock. He's a bit Maigret, and he's an awful lot of something completely original and different. It's quirky, it's surreal, it's absolutely fascinating. She's an historian, so it's loaded with historical stuff as well, and you get this. It could be absolutely crazy, because I think this one starts with 3 guys who are murdered by spiders. And the only person who sees the connection is Adamsberg, and it starts the hunt for a serial killer. And it could be really stupid, but actually in her hands, it's just absolutely fascinating.
Yes.
It's hard to say, but she's just the epitome of that surreal French feel that they have. The little
you mentioned
humor.
You mentioned the surrealism, so I'm going to ask other people like Laura and Victoria. Some people find her surrealism and her edginess resistible. Do you like her, Laura?
Yeah, I love a lot of French crime. I mean, people like Francois Pascal, just my favorite, among my favorite writers. But I find that a little bit of self-conscious Gallic whimsy goes a very, very long way.
Yes. Well, in fact, there's somebody in this panel who used to be the little English boy in his French school, and that's Maxim. So, little English boy, are you a fan of Fred Vargas?
Like Laura, I'm not a great fan of Fred Vargas, although I have a distinction of probably being the only person on this panel who's actually danced with her on a beach.
Oh. I think you're probably the only person who can read her in French as well, Maxim.
So we're going back to domestic noir, which I suppose it's not surprising it's a topic of the evening for Ayo's choice for 2012, and this is, I think, Aidan or Louise possibly asked if it was going to be included, is Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn.
For me, it wasn't so much about the domestic noir, it was the unreliable narration. That's what drew me in with the book. And the fact that both the main characters were totally unlikable people.
Yes.
And if you always have books where, you know, you kind of really like one person and not like the other, it gets stale.
Yes.
And this was just, to some extent, this was like a breath of fresh air. That's why
I can remember that when Gillian Flynn's earlier books, which were all very well written, but this was kind of like a bombshell, wasn't it, Laura?
Yeah, I think it really started something, Gone Girl. I enjoyed 3/4 of it. I thought the end, just what the hell happened there? I don't know. But the first 3/4 I thought were wonderful. And I think it's the only book I can think of where an actual speech, which is what became known as the Cool Girl rant, it became so sort of famous. And I can't believe that there was any woman who didn't read that and just go, yes, 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 yes.
So maybe that's what it is as well that was the appeal, because I mean it's one of those books that's still being, everything's compared to it. It's the new Gone Girl. It's the you know, but maybe, you know, and we think we know the reason why, that brilliant midway twist, and you the characterizations and the fantastic psychopath that's Amy, all those are brilliant elements. But I wonder as well if it's that we do see part of ourselves in it in a way that we don't want to, and it's you know, talking about that Cool Girl rant, for example, you know, we're having to relate to somebody who's utterly despicable and hold a mirror up to ourselves and see a reflection we may not want to see. Possibly.
Can I just, going back to Laura's demand for topics, and this will affect her as well as me, here's something.
Stop making this my fault!
It was a very good suggestion, Laura, which is why I'm following your suggestion. Somebody writes for The Guardian, I write for the FT. I've noticed a trend, and Mark Sanderson at the Times has noticed this. We used to pick up books 10 years ago that said, wonderful, Laura Wilson, The Times, or whatever. Now books only say, wonderful, Mark Billingham, wonderful, Sarah Pinborough. So do you think, Laura, that newspaper critics like us are losing their influence?
Oh,
tricky one. And I don't know the answer, actually, but I mean, nowadays anyway, it's sort of different, because I think when you get puffs by other authors, there's a tendency, certainly if you're an insider, to think, oh, well, they're probably published by the same house, or maybe that's just me being cynical.
no,
Sorry.
No, it happens. I've heard it being said.
Yeah. But also it's not only critics for newspapers, it's bloggers and all sorts of other things as well. I mean, anyone can have an opinion. I suspect that we have more, well, I suppose, heft, Barry.
Yes, we do have heft.
Can I interject?
We do have heft, more heft than we had at the beginning of lockdown, yeah.
Victoria, you were going to add something.
I was going to interject, actually. I think they serve different purposes. I think the wonderful things about critics in magazines and newspapers is you're reaching a broader audience. So somebody who's picking up the papers on Sunday and is flicking through and looking for recommendations, they're literally starting from that point. They don't know where to go. We're telling them where to go. But when you're walking into a bookshop and you see an author you've liked has blurbed for another book, it makes you think, oh, well, maybe that's going to be a similar sort of book, and therefore I might like it. So I don't think it's that one is more valuable than another. I just think they serve different purposes.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
well, I'd be very wary of that, though, because you get this thing on the back of books where they say things like, it's like John le Carre and Ian Fleming.
Yes.
And it can't possibly be.
Yes, it can't
so
be.
Definitely
but then that's the publisher, isn't it? It's like, this is always the twist you'll never see coming.
But it's somebody they found who said it. You know, I like to build up a relationship with a critic. I want to know that I get what they're saying, you know, and I feel then that I can trust them.
Yeah. But I think online as well, when they say, oh, it's like, I don't know, John le Carre or Gone Girl or whatever, it's possibly something to do with the algorithm, is it? She says naively.
It's absolutely that.
Yes. Well, now on this panel, we also have the little English boy in the French school who's also the chair of the Crime Writers Association. So in terms of influence, Maxim, do you think that the Dagger wins that we announced last week are still influential in terms of sales, or just prestige?
Sadly, I would say prestige. I mean, hopefully they will add incremental sales along the way if the publishers get behind them, sticker the paperbacks, or whatever, or obviously mention the fact that the authors won a Dagger on a later book. But I think basically prestige, yes. I mean, I've seen basically a social media analysis of the Dagger Evening, and half of the press we had came from Korea. Purely because the winner of the crime fiction in translation was a Korean author. Korean media were all over it the next day. We had
who is that?
We had nearly 40 cuttings.
Wow.
So, I mean, as I said, it's the publishing machine and the question of quotes. I mean, Lee Child is wonderful. He's the kindest person there is because he will never give you a bad quote.
Yes.
So now,
which slightly
out there, including mine, have got a wonderful quote from Lee Child saying that we're wonderful.
Okay, let's go back to our list because we are going to get through at least our first 10 choices because I'm moving you all on, so forgive me for that. So, Victoria, your 2017 choice was Behind Her Eyes by Sarah Pinborough.
Yeah, I can say this quickly because I think this is a very, very clever book that obviously works on two levels. It works brilliantly as a psychological, not a psychological suspense, domestic noir, but then of course that ending changes it, and you see how brilliantly crafted it is. And I mean, it's so obvious, isn't it? I feel boring saying it because it's the thing everybody says, but it's true. That ending blew me away. And it turns you right back to the beginning to see if it works. And oh, yes, it does. And how well it does.
Yeah, I agree entirely. So, Laura, your 2014 choice, we're just about keeping parity with everyone, was You by Caroline Kepnes.
Yeah, absolutely wonderful book. I didn't like the Netflix series or You So Well, you know, the TV. But I just loved it because it's just sort of like a modern Tom Ripley. And I really like the social commentary as well. I do like a bit of that in a crime novel. And that you're rooting for this actually really unsavory character. It made me laugh. Yeah, yes. It was great. I don't think Hidden Bodies and the other one, the name of which I can't now remember, were so good, but I thought You was smashing.
Yeah, the style was so brilliant as well, wasn't it? I mean,
it was very refreshing.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, Paul, you picked more than anyone else a series of series. So I'm going to ask you to defend one. I don't need defending because I agree this guy is really good. It's the House of Wolves series by James Carlos Blake.
Yes.
Okay, well, I can tell you, well, putting it into why the series is important, I think obviously you get character development, but it's more about, this is a chronicle of an American century and an American-Mexican century because it crosses the borders. And so it's a book so grounded in its landscape and its people and the problems that are down there and the crimes and the family that decides it wants to go straight, you know, half of them do, half of them don't. That it, for me, is a chronicle of a century. That's what I find so valuable.
Can I just say, he's also another book, another series, another author, I should say, that I think is so underrated. And I wish more people read about him because I think it's a wonderful, wonderful series. And there's so much nuance in this series from him about the way the relationships within the family, about those who are trying to go straight and those who are kind of like digging their heels in and want to continue to commit crime. It's just wonderful. Yeah,
and the intergenerational thing. Yeah, absolutely brilliant.
Okay, well,
I agree with you. I mean, I think he should be known like Don Winslow. You know.
I agree. He needs to be brought out into the sunlight. So while we're still with series, Maxim, you picked the Aberystwyth series by Malcolm Price. We haven't talked about comic crime tonight, have we?
Oh, yes.
They're lovely.
I think it's the most delightful series. Obviously, I cheated slightly because obviously the earlier books were not part of the decade, but the last two were. How can I describe them? They're impossible to describe. They're quirky. It's about the only private eye in Aberystwyth. The local mafia are druids. He falls in love with the local sort of fortune teller, who is a femme fatale. It's everything. It's got Atlantis. It's got the famous Welsh invasion of Patagonia. I think it's the most brilliant comic, but also really compassionate series around. And I think Louis Knight is my favorite private eye of all time.
I can remember 20 years ago, Welsh crime writers or would-be Welsh crime writers saying to me, the publishers would say to them, nobody believes that there's any crime in Wales. It's not fecund territory for he's proved them wrong, has he not?
Well, so Laura, actually,
Go
It's
on.
not the Wales that any of us know.
No, it isn't. It's an
No.
alternative universe, Wales, isn't it? So, Laura, your 2013 choice was, very good writer, Megan Abbott's Dare Me.
Ooh, yes.
Yes, wonderful. I almost wept with relief that I am no longer a teenage girl when I read this. Not that I ever was a cheerleader, you understand, but, you know, that it just... She does female friendship so well. She's the queen of that. Writes beautifully, and it's just it was a wonderful and so sad. She is so good on adolescent girls, and in fact, I really recommend that too. I mean, all her books are wonderful.
From her early books, the Queen Pin and stuff like that, the noir.
Yes, because she started doing the noir, didn't she? And the end of everything is also wonderful, and all the later stuff. And it was hard to choose one, but of this year, I thought Dare Me was really special.
You mentioned, and we're going back to topics here, Laura, an interesting point about female friendships. I saw a recent piece in The Guardian which said that there was some degree of responsibility among women writers to show female friendships in a more sisterly light.
Why?
That too many female friendships, this writer said, are poisonous, and that women have more of an obligation to show them as being in a more sisterly light.
Oh, sorry, that's a load of codswallop.
I
That's
agree.
just
Obligation.
Sorry, just nonsense. There's no obligation at all.
No.
That's like saying a Jewish writer must always show Jewish people in a good light. It's just nonsense. I'd say it's bollocks, but it's a wrong word. But
Yeah, but you write for The Guardian, Laura, so as a fellow Guardian writer.
And
so
she has no obligation.
I don't have an obligation to show other Guardian writers in a good light.
Exactly.
So, Victoria, your 2014 choice was also You by Caroline Kepnes.
Yeah, and I'm going to echo, we've already covered really, haven't we, why? I think what I loved about it was the rooting for this despicable character. I thought it was so, I mean, because you know right from the start, there's no hiding of who he is. But you're rooting for him. He's doing these terrible things. You're going, go on, get away with it. And I was questioning myself the whole way through. What the hell is wrong with me? And it's not until that final scene that I will not spoil that you finally, your morality kicks in. And I just think, what a genius.
Yes.
I thought it was just me at first, actually, that felt that way. I was very relieved to find.
No.
So, Maxim, your choice for 2015 was All the Old Knives by Olin Steinhauer.
Again, a wonderful espionage thriller, but this is another Twilight book because basically almost the whole book is two people in a bar talking to each other and going over their mutual past and basically unveiling different layers of what the truth was. And I think it's a very short book and it's a perfect book.
Yes, okay. Well, I'm going to ask you all to start thinking, because we've got quarter of an hour left, and we will get through our first 10 choices of a topic you think is pressing in the context of this discussion. So my choice for 2012, and I think some of you are going to agree with me, and we haven't mentioned him yet, was The Lewis Man by Peter May.
Ooh, Peter.
Yeah, and he's somebody who created a tremendous sense of locale and place, particularly with that book. Any other Peter May admirers in the panel?
Yes, definitely, yeah.
Paul?
Since his days writing Take the High Road. No?
That was a while ago.
No, yeah, absolutely. He does create an atmosphere. I was a bit worried, I must admit, the first time round, because I had this vision of the Wicker Man in my head and the possibility that he'd just wind up writing something derivative. But that's not true. He's a very interesting writer.
Well,
very enjoyable writer.
Again, Ayo and I have chosen the same book, so I'm going to let you defend this one. Or talk.
Leave it to me, Barry.
I'm sorry, Ayo, you're up for this one. We both picked Crooked Letter by Tom Franklin.
Yes, it was, and I don't normally say this, it was very literary in some ways, and also very understated. And it was just one of those books that once you started reading it, you just really couldn't put it down. And the way in which Tom Franklin just draws you into this story, you wonder what happened to this girl when they went to the drive-in and she disappears and nobody knows what happened. And I just thought that it was a book that it was one of the few books that literally stayed with me after I finished reading it.
I expected when that was so good, and again a literary crime novel, I expected great things from him. But then he started to write books with his wife, and something seemed to happen.
Yeah.
Their personalities didn't gel, or I don't know.
To be fair, if I wrote a book with my husband, I don't suppose that would gel much either.
It is. Well, it works with Nicky French, doesn't it? I suppose one has to say. So, Maxim, we're getting towards, so start thinking of topics, people. I want topics from you.
I've got one. I've got a topic for you.
Well, hang on to that thought, Victoria. So, Maxim, you picked Cemetery of Forgotten Books Quartet by Carlos Ruiz Zafón.
Basically, as everybody knows, obviously, I am totally partial to books in translation, having spent much of my life in foreign countries, being educated elsewhere in Europe. I thought basically from the first book onwards, not a line disappointed. They're magical. It's the stuff of magic. Obviously, it evokes a city. It evokes the history of Spain. It's got mystery. It's got beautiful love stories. It's got horror, and basically, from the first book to the final book, I think it's an epic masterpiece. In the tradition of Victor Hugo or Alexander Dumas.
Okay.
It's basically storytelling at its best.
There we are. We can't get higher praise than that. Now, Laura's choice for 2012, it's an author we haven't yet talked about, and I agree, she is one of the very best writers of psychological crime at work today, and you picked Broken Harbour by Tana French.
Yes, that's right. I came sort of a bit late to Tana French. I thought the first one, which I think was called In the Woods, was a bit overwritten, and I wasn't terribly convinced or terribly keen. But then somebody said, no, have another go. And I think they've got better and better. I thought The Witch Elm, which is much more recent, was wonderful. It was her first standalone. But this Dublin Murder Squad series, where each time she will pick a different character, somebody who will be sort of slightly to the side in the previous book will come to the fore in this book. And this book, Broken Harbour, it's about an apparent family annihilation where father kills wife and children, although mother is sort of hanging on to life by a thread. And it takes place in one of the ghost estates, because it's just after the Celtic tiger turned its claws up and died. And the man's lost his job and so on. And so again, you get social commentary, but she's a wonderful writer. I think up there with people like Ruth Rendell's Barbara Vine. So highly recommended.
This is slightly off topic, but I remember having a meal with her, Hodder gave some decades ago. And rather like Mo Hader, she's kind of vanished. She does not like being seen in public and doing events. So Victoria, are you up for all the events you're going to have to do for your new book?
Absolutely, if there's lobster and champagne, Barry.
Nice one, Victoria.
Okay, we're getting close to our last book of our choices. Laura, you had let's get say that you're on your final book. Laura, you had Turn of Mind by Alice LaPlante.
Yes, this was came out at a time when there were an awful lot of books with unreliable narrators because they had amnesia and this kind of thing. You remember Before I Go to Sleep was big that year. But this one I thought was really special. It is American. She's an American writer, and it's about a neurosurgeon who has Alzheimer's, and one of her best friends is killed. And she can't remember if she did it. Half the time, she can't even remember who this woman was. And it's a wonderful portrait of this fractured mind. And we see the police investigation refracted through her. And it's got a real wham bam ending. And it's so well done. I think it is her best book.
Okay, in answer to Aidan's question about a shout out for Donna Leon, I think the problem with our choices, Aidan, was the fact that rather like Alfred Hitchcock, who never got an Academy Award, it's a body of work, and Donna Leon's body of work, we're talking about individual books here. So your 2013 book, Victoria, is this an example of domestic noir? Apple Tree Yard by Louise Doughty.
Yeah, it is domestic noir, isn't it? But I think it's an example of domestic noir really well done in a different way. And it's not your lit window with your shadowy figure. And what I loved about it so much was the actual storytelling itself. So the fact that we're halfway through the book to actually find out who's been murdered, and just that drip, drip, drip works really well. She's an excellent storyteller. And I read it, years ago now. It came out, when did you say?
2012.
But yeah, and there are still passages I remember and think back on. That chimpanzee passage, remember, where the mother, how she'll walk on her own baby to save her feet. That stuck with me. So I mean, all those years later, it's a memorable
line, isn't it?
It's a memorable line, but brilliantly told. I mean, we can all tell the same line in the same way.
Yes. And so, Paul, getting towards the end of your choice, you picked the Gun Street Girls series by Adrian McKinty.
Well, again, it's this thing about chronicles. I mean, I much prefer this. I think Adrian McKinty's The Chain is a lovely, entertaining little read, but I really wish he'd get back to writing these Irish books, because they're part of a chronicle of a place and time. Yeah. And I think they help you to understand Britain. They certainly help you to understand Ireland and help you to understand the Troubles. You can engage with them. You don't have to agree with them, but there's so many issues in these books. And he has a sense of humor.
Yeah. Yes, indeed.
Catholic detective. I mean, that's a fairly standard thing. Catholic detective in the RUC, but he does it so well.
Yes. Okay, before we do everyone's final book, Laura, can you think of a topic that we should discuss that we haven't yet discussed?
Talk about put me on the spot. I just wondered if anyone thinks that there are now more books with multiple points of view than there used to be. I'm not saying that's a bad or a good thing, but everything I read at the moment seems to be multiple POV, and I just wondered if you thought that was a very good point. And in fact,
I don't know if you agree in your review, but when I reviewed the last Paula Hawkins, which had 17 points of view,
wow,
I was completely lost.
Yeah,
I would remember the bolshy teenager, the punky teenager, but then I was thinking, is this the aunt? Is this a friend of the family? The book, but I struggled to keep up with all those points of view.
Yeah, for that reason, I was extremely glad that The Guardian wanted to solace it, which gave me an out, because I found it very hard to keep track of. Yeah.
Right.
I agree, though. I think generally multiple points of view can be difficult. I think you don't ever want more than 3 at the most narrators. Otherwise, you lose track of them. You can't get into their skin in the same way, can you?
Couldn't you do, Victoria, what Ian Forster criticised Dickens for doing this, that when a character like Mr. Pickwick comes on, Mr. Micawber, they do something which tells the reader who they are.
Yes.
They say they have a catchphrase or something about their attitude. Oh, yeah, it's him.
You signpost them in that way. Yeah, which is very elegant.
Could you do that in psychological crime now, or would it seem too on the nail?
I think you can do it in anything. I think people have tics and ways of being. And I think it's a great way of portraying character. But I think it's still, the point about having too many points of view still stands, even if you have ways to signpost them.
Right. Have you struggled with books which have got too many points of view?
Yes, they actually really put me off. I mean, it's not that I can't cope with them. I just think that you concentrate your mind a lot more about what's being written if there's not too many points of view. Then you will enjoy the book a lot more as well. Because if there are too many points of view, you'll start I think they go off on a tangent thinking, well, who am I reading? Who's saying this?
Yes, there's that moment, isn't there, that it's getting used to that voice again. And it's like too many times that you have to do that. It takes you out of the story, I think.
Yeah, you start discounting characters and not really taking much interest in some of the stories.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So, Maxim, have you ever had, as a writer, any editor saying to you, can we remove a character or two? It's getting a bit crowded.
No, I haven't. I've had them asked whether I can take out a sex scene, but not characters.
Take out a sex scene.
I've been asked to put them in.
This is a badge of honor for Maxim, and I know he doesn't mind me telling people this. When Crime Time was a magazine, the only letter of complaint I had was running a story by Maxim. And they said, why are you running this pornography? And I said, well, he's also a very good writer. He may write the... We're now in the last 5 minutes, so let's at least do our final choices. I should tell everybody who's listening that everything that we're talking about will appear on the Crime Time website tomorrow, including our backup choices, which we haven't talked about. But Maxim, we did talk about all our principal choices. So, Paul, your last choice was the Blood Curse series by Maurizio Di Giovanni.
Yeah, I disagree with everybody about the thing about reading books to kind of get comfort and things. I love to read books that challenge me, and I still want to be in this disturbing, dark field, even in the COVID period. Yeah. But this is my one romantic exception to this. These are beautifully literary written books. It's about a detective who's he sees dead people, or you can see the last moments of somebody who's dying. But the curious thing about the books is there's a love story running through it. He's got 2 women chasing after him. It sounds like some bloke's wet dream, It's not that.
You always said about sex scenes and things.
Now, this guy, he's utterly tormented by this and the thought of bringing these people into his life because of the darkness that's in his life. And they're just so beautifully written, these books, that when there's a new one coming out, I'm as desperate to find out about this man's love life as I am to find out about the mystery. And that's unusual.
Well, my final choice was, in fact, I can't remember if it was Victoria or Laura or Ayo said, you're reading a book and you think, oh, it's that plot again. Whichever of you said that. Here's a writer who, generally speaking, comes up with something completely different for each book. So my 2010 choice was Blacklands by Belinda Bauer.
Yes.
Anybody else like that?
Yes, I think Laura was wanting to say something.
Yeah, no, I feel a sort of an ownership of this one. And the reason is that a couple of years before it came out, I think, I was doing the winnowing for the Crime Writers Association debut Dagger, which at that time had to have somebody who would pair all the entries, which was something like 3,000 words in an outline, maybe different now, I don't know, to say 10 or 12. And that will go before the panel of industry professionals who would judge the winner. And it was an awful lot of reading to do. And one night I'm sitting on the sofa alongside my then dog, who was a basset hound called Freeway. And I just had a run of really bad ones. So bad were they that I was thinking, I think I've just lost the ability to know if something's good. And it was 11:30 and I thought, shall I carry on and make a cup of coffee and go on, or shall I just give it up as a bad and go to bed? So I was reading a particularly appalling, egregious example, and I stuck it under the dog's nose and said, what do you think? And Freeway rolled his eyes and farted so loudly. And I thought, you know what? If I could just put that in a column for a really bad book, that would be, but it made me laugh. So I made a cup of coffee and I carried on. And the very next manuscript I picked up was Blacklands by Belinda Bauer. And I had an actual physical reaction. I didn't fart, just, you know, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. And I read one paragraph, I thought, my God, this is really good. Second paragraph, this is really, really, really good. Third paragraph, this is fantastic. Fourth paragraph, this woman is going to be a star. Wow. And it was just this wonderful moment. And it actually didn't win. The book by Amma Anwar won, which was published many years later. And I think that fact tells you quite a lot about the lack of diversity in publishing at the time compared to how it was later on when his book was published. Because
we've only got one minute.
Sorry, I'll shut up now.
So very quickly, Maxim, all books featuring Skink by Carl Hiaasen. Just a sentence about Carl Hiaasen.
He's funny, he's hilarious, he's gut-spitting, he's wonderful.
Fair enough, that's very pithy. Victoria, it's already been talked about, but your final choice, Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn.
Yeah, we talked about it. Brilliant. Cult medicine. All of the above.
Laura has already talked about Belinda Bauer. Ayo's final choice was Belinda Bauer. So everybody who's listening, I hope you've enjoyed it. We didn't get through all the books, but we did get through our initial 10 choices. Everything will appear on the Crime Time website tomorrow. And might I thank Laura Wilson, Maxim Jakubowski, Paul Burke, Ayo Onatade, and Victoria Selman. And good night, everybody.
And thank you, Barry.
And thank you, Barry.
Thank you, Barry.
Wonderful chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.